3 lines on a folded sheet of grey paper would kill the most famous man in Russia, and the woman who would be blamed for it had not yet read them. She was 24. Her name was Natalia Nikolaevna Pushkina, and on the evening of the 4th of November, 1836, she stood at the tall mirror in the apartment on the Moika and fastened a single white camellia into her dark hair, while her husband, in the next room, sealed a letter he would not let her see. She heard the candle gutter as he leaned over it. She heard the small, wet sound of the seal pressed into wax. She did not ask what the letter was. In 4 years of marriage, she had learned that there were 2 kinds of silence in that apartment. The silence of a poem being written, which was a full silence, warm, like a held breath, and the silence of a poem being refused, which was cold and had edges. This was the second kind. She fastened the camellia and watched her own hands in the glass and waited. The Anichkov palace expected them at 9. It was the Anichkov that ruled her winters now, more than the winter palace, more than the church on the corner where she lit candles for her dead father. The Anichkov was where the emperor kept his smaller balls, the intimate ones, where 200 people were invited instead of 3,000, and an invitation to the Anichkov was not an honor you could decline. 2 winters back, Nicholas had made her husband a Kammerjunker, a gentleman of the chamber, the lowest court rank, the rank given to boys of 18. Pushkin was 37. He had worn the green and gold uniform to the first ball with the face of a man wearing another man's coat, and he had understood at once, as she had understood, why the rank had been given. It was not for him. It was so that she could come to the Anichkov. The emperor liked to see her dance. "You have not told me," she said, when he came into the room with his gloves in his hand, "whether the Narishkins will be there." "Everyone will be there." He looked at her in the mirror. He was not a tall man, and he had learned years ago to stand very straight, and the side whiskers had a little grey in them now that the candlelight found, and her own eyes refused. "You look," he said, "the way you looked the first time, at the Yogel ball. You were 16, and you had a wreath of something gold in your hair, and I could not make my mouth work." "I was 17. "You were 16. I have the date. I have written it down somewhere." He came and stood behind her and did not touch her, and in the mirror the 2 of them looked, for a moment, like a portrait that someone had commissioned and then quarrelled with the painter over. "Natasha, if a man speaks to you tonight—" He stopped. "If a man speaks to me," she said, "I shall answer him. That is what is done. That is what you brought me to Petersburg to do." The letter lay on the writing desk behind them, sealed, the wax still soft enough to show the ring's mark if you pressed it. She could not read the direction from where she stood. She did not try. She had learned not to try. They went down to the carriage in silence of the second kind. The man who would shoot her husband in the snow 11 weeks later was, that same evening, having his white Chevalier Guard uniform brushed by a servant in a house on the Nevsky, and he was in an excellent humour. Georges Dompes was 24 years old, the same age as Natalia, fair-haired, with the kind of open, laughing face that made older women want to mother him, and younger women want to be looked at by him, and he had spent the afternoon writing a letter in French to the man he now called his father. The man was not his father. Baron Louis van Heekeren, the Dutch envoy to the Russian court, had met Georges Dantes 3 years earlier at a coaching inn, when the young Frenchman lay sick with a chest fever, and had nursed him and arranged his commission in the Chevalier Guards, and that spring had formally adopted him, a grown man of 23, an adoption so unusual that the whole of Petersburg had a theory about it, and most of the theories were unkind. Dantes did not care about the theories. He had a name now that opened doors, a regiment that suited his figure, and the favour of a man who refused him nothing. and he had Natalia Pushkina, or believed he was close to having her, which to a young man of his temper amounted to the same thing. "You will be careful tonight," Hikarin said. He was standing in the doorway in his dressing gown, watching the servant work, and his long, clever face had no expression that a stranger could have read. The husband watches now. He did not watch in the summer. He watches now. "The husband," said Dantes, settling the silver cuirass, "writes poems about the sea and cannot pay his tailor. I have it from his tailor. He owes everyone in Petersburg, and he is jealous of a woman who has given him 4 children and never once given me her hand for longer than a quadrille requires." He turned, and the candlelight ran down the silver of the breastplate. "You worry too much." "I worry," Hekaron said, "exactly the right amount. I have buried one career already. I do not intend to bury yours over a Russian poet's wife." He came into the room. He straightened, with 2 fingers, a fold of the white sash that the servant had left crooked, and the gesture was the gesture of a man arranging something he owned. "Dance with her twice, not 3 times. Twice is gallantry. 3 times is a sentence. Do you understand me, Georges?" "I understand you." "Twice." "Twice," said Dante, and smiled at himself in the glass, and did not mean it. The ballroom at the Anichkov was not large. That was its cruelty. At the Winter Palace, a woman who wished to avoid a man could lose herself among 3,000 guests and the whole length of the great state halls. At the Anichkov, there were 200 people in 3 connected rooms, and the emperor's smaller balls had the quality of a family dinner at which everyone watched everyone and remembered it. Natalia felt the watching the moment she came up the stair. It moved with her, the way warmth moves off a stove. Not directed, simply present, the attention of a room that had decided some time ago that she was the most beautiful woman in Russia, and now examined her each season to see whether it was still true. It was still true. She knew it without vanity, the way she knew the apartment on the Moika cost more than they had, and the way she knew her husband had not slept. Her beauty was a fact about the world, like the cold, and like the cold, it was chiefly other people's weather. She had been beautiful in a province where it bought her nothing, and a mother who counted it as the family's one negotiable asset, and had negotiated. She did not think her face was hers. She thought it was a thing she had been given to carry into rooms. Pushkin left her almost at once. He had seen Vyazemsky by the card-room door, and he went to him the way a man goes toward the one warm corner of a cold house. And Natalia understood, and was not hurt, and took her place among the women near the windows, where the unmarried girls and the young wives stood in their pale gowns and waited to be asked. Princess Vyazemskaya found her there and took her arm. "He is here," the princess said quietly. She did not say who. She did not need to. "I see that he is here. Catherine is watching him watch you. Your sister wears her heart on the outside of her dress, Natasha. It is not kind to her. Half the room knows she would take him tomorrow." "Half the room is generally right," said Natalia, and the princess laughed, and for a moment it was almost an ordinary evening. Then the music changed for the first dance, and Dantes crossed the room. He crossed it badly. That was the thing she would remember afterward, in the country, in the years when she had a great deal of time to remember things. A clever man would have come to her sideways, would have spoken to the princess first, would have made the approach look like an accident of the room. Dantes came straight across the open floor, in front of 200 people, with the cuirass catching every candle, and he bowed, and he asked her for the dance in the loud, frank French of a man who wanted to be seen asking, and she felt the room turn very slightly, the way a field of wheat turns when one gust crosses it. She could have refused. A woman could always refuse the first. Only a refusal of every dance was the true insult. But to refuse him here, in front of the Emperor's 200, would itself be a statement, a public drawing of the line, and the line once drawn could not be rubbed out, and she did not yet know. This was the truth she would defend to herself for the rest of her life. She did not yet know that the line needed drawing. She thought him a vain boy. She thought one dance would cost less than a scene. She gave him her hand. "You are pale tonight, madame," he said, when the figure brought them together. His Russian was poor, and he did not use it. They spoke the French that everyone in the room spoke. "It does not suit you. You should not be pale. Paleness is for women who have something to regret, and you have nothing. You presume to know what I have. I know that a man who deserved you would not let you stand by the window with the unmarried girls." The figure parted them. When it brought them back, his face had changed, had put on the seriousness that she had learned to distrust most of all, because it was the cheapest thing he owned. "I would not let you stand by any window in any city in the world. I would burn the window." "That is a great deal of arson," she said, "for a quadrille." And she saw it land, saw the laugh jump into his eyes before he could stop it, and despised herself a little for being pleased that she could still make a man laugh against his own intentions. The dance turned. Across the room, her husband stood with Wyazemski and did not appear to be looking at her, and she knew, the way a wife knows, that he had not looked away from her once. Hecarin had said, twice. Dantes danced with her twice that evening, and the second time he said nothing clever at all, which frightened her far more than the first, because a silent Dantes was a Dantes who believed himself in earnest, and a man who believes himself in earnest will do the thing that a vain man only threatens. She did not dance with him a third time. She was careful. She was, that whole autumn, more careful than anyone afterward would ever credit her with being. But care, she was about to learn, is a defense against your own conduct, and she had no defense at all against other people's pens. The thing arrived 3 days later, on the 7th, in the Morning Post, and it did not come to her. It came to her husband and to 7 or 8 other men about the city, all on the same morning, all in the same disguised hand, all on the same cheap grey paper, folded the same way, a printed-looking certificate, a mock diploma, written in French in the formula of a club admitting a new member. It named Pushkin, coadjutor of the most serene order of cuckolds, and historiographer of the order. It was signed with invented names. It was an old, filthy, common form of insult, the kind of thing schoolboys sent, except that this one had been sent to a man who had been made to wear a boy's uniform to please the emperor, about a wife the emperor liked to watch dance, and it had been sent to 7 other men so that the joke would be in the city by noon, and no power on earth could call it back. Natalia was in the nursery when it came. The 2 eldest were quarrelling over a wooden horse, and the baby was teething, and she had a smear of arrowroot on her sleeve, and she heard the front door, and she heard her husband's step in the passage, and she heard the step stop. It did not come on to the nursery. That was how she knew. She stood in the middle of the children, with the wooden horse in her hand, the way one stands when one has heard, through a wall, the exact sound of one's life dividing into the part that came before and the part that would come after. And she did not yet know what the sound had been, only that it had been the door of the study closing, very softly, very precisely, the way her husband closed a door when he had decided not to let her hear him weep. By noon the next day, the city had the joke, exactly as it had been designed to have it, and a man named Sologub, 23 years old and frightened, was climbing the stairs to the apartment on the Moika with a piece of paper in his pocket that he did not want to deliver. He had been to a second on a dueling matter once, in Moscow, and had thought himself a man of the world for it. He was about to discover that he was not. Pushkin received him in the study among the books, standing in a dressing gown, unshaven, with the grey diploma open on the desk where Natalia was not permitted to come, and he was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. He had already written the cartel. He had already drafted the cartel the previous afternoon, naming the hour and asking only for the name of his opponent's second. And he handed Sologub the copy now, the way another man might hand over a laundry list. "You will carry it to Dantes," Pushkin said, "or to the man he calls his father, which is the same address. I do not greatly care which of them stands in front of the pistol. They have made themselves, by this—" He touched the grey paper without looking at it, the way one touches a thing one cannot bear to look at and cannot stop touching. "A single animal with two heads. I will fire at whichever head presents itself." "Alexander Sergeyevich," Sologub said, "you cannot be certain they sent it." "I am certain of the only thing that matters. It is about her, and it is in the city, and there is one road out of that, and it ends at the Black River or somewhere like it." He looked, for the first time, directly at the younger man, and Sologub said afterward that he had never in his life seen such tiredness held so straight. "You think I am hot. I am not hot. I have been cold about this for a week. A poem you can rewrite. A wife in the mouth of Petersburg you cannot rewrite. There is only the one ending, and the only question is the date. The duel did not happen. It did not happen because the men around it spent 2 weeks doing what men of the court did best, which was to convert a matter of blood into a matter of arrangement. And the arrangement they found was so strange that it silenced even the people who had laughed loudest. Hecaran, terrified for the career he had built around his adopted son, set every intermediary in the city to pleading for delay, and in the delay a thing surfaced that he offered to the whole city as proof of his son's innocence, and that Natalia would carry as a private wound for the rest of her days. Georges Dantes, the man who had crossed an open ballroom for her, announced that he wished to marry her sister. Catherine Goncharova, 27, plain beside her famous sister, a maid of honor to the Empress and unmarried and quietly desperate, who had been watching Dantes across rooms for a year with her heart, as the princess had said, on the outside of her dress. "He will marry Katya," Natalia said. She was sitting at the small table by the window where she did the household accounts, and the November light came in flat and grey off the moika, and she had a column of figures in front of her that did not add the way she needed them to add. "He crossed the whole Anichkov to dance with me, and now he will marry my sister, and I am to understand from this that he never wanted me at all, that I imagined it, that I am a vain woman who mistook a young man's courtesy to her sister for—" She stopped. She put down the pen. "Do you believe it, Alexandrine?" Her other sister, Alexandra, the one who lived with them, who saw everything in that apartment and said almost none of it, was mending a child's stocking by the same window. "I believe," Alexandra said carefully, "that he is doing it to stop a bullet. I believe he would marry the Empress's spaniel to stop a bullet. And I believe Katya knows it and is taking him anyway, because a man who marries you to escape your sister is still a husband, and Katya is 27, and there is no other husband on the table." She bit the thread. "You should be glad. It ends it." "It does not end it. You do not understand him if you think it ends it." She understood him, by then, better than she wanted to. She understood that a man like Dantes could not bear to look small, and that nothing in the world made a man look smaller than to be told, by the whole of Petersburg, that he had run from a duel into a marriage of convenience with the plain sister of the woman he had publicly wanted. He would have to prove now that he had not run. He would have to be seen, after the wedding, doing the thing only a man with nothing to hide would dare to do, which was to go on looking at her exactly as before, in front of everyone, as her brother now, family, untouchable, beyond reproach, and there was no defense against that at all, because you cannot challenge a man for the way he looks at your wife at his own wedding breakfast. The figures on the table still did not add. This was the part that no one wrote down, afterward, in the memoirs and the biographies, because it was not romantic, and it did not fit the legend either of the heartless beauty or the tragic muse. Natalia Pushkina spent the autumn of the most famous scandal in Russian letters trying to make the household money last until the new year. The apartment on the Moika took more rooms than they needed and more rubles a year than they had, and her husband earned a court salary that would not cover the half of it, and the difference was made up of advances against books not yet written and loans against a name that everyone in Petersburg respected, and no tradesman in Petersburg would extend credit to twice. She kept the accounts because he could not. He could write 1,000 lines that would outlive the empire, and he could not, would not, keep a column of rubles from leaking out the bottom of a page. And so it fell to her, the beautiful, useless ornament, the cause of all the trouble, to sit at the window with the milliner's bill and the wine merchant's bill and the bill from the man who had re-shod the carriage horses, and decide which of them could be made to wait another month. She had been raised to this without knowing it. Her grandfather, old Goncharov, had owned a fortune and linen factories near Kaluga, and a great house with a bronze statue of the Empress Catherine in the garden, too large to move, that the family in its decline had tried for years to sell for scrap, and could not. And her father had inherited the fortune and lost his mind, literally, a darkening that the family did not name, and her mother had inherited the ruins, and a daughter whose face was the only asset that had not depreciated. So Natalia had grown up in a house that was grand and cold and behind on its bills, watching a beautiful object, the statue, herself, fail to convert into money. And she had married a poet expecting, perhaps, warmth, and had found instead the same house, grand and cold and behind on its bills, in a different city, with a man who loved her and could not, any more than her father could, keep the roof from leaking. "I will speak to the princess about the dressmaker," she said. "She knows a woman near the Haymarket. Cheaper." "You cannot go to the Anichkov in a Haymarket gown." "Then I will not go to the Anichkov." She said it lightly. It was not light. To refuse the Anichkov was to refuse the emperor, and to refuse the emperor was a thing a Kammerjunker's wife could not do. And so she would go, and the gown would be made, and the bill would join the others at the window. And this too was a thing the legend never recorded, that the woman blamed for vanity went to the balls that ruined her husband, partly because she was commanded to, and partly because there was, in the going, the one cold comfort left to a poor, beautiful woman, which was that, for the length of a quadrille, she was not the household's chief debtor, but its chief treasure, and the difference, God forgive her, felt like air. The wedding was set for the 10th of January. Pushkin withdrew the challenge because the marriage made it impossible to press without dishonoring his own sister-in-law, and the city decided that the matter was closed. And the city was wrong, and the only people who knew the city was wrong were the 4 people standing in the center of it. Hecarin knew because he had bought the delay and not the peace, and lay awake doing sums of risk in a language of diplomacy that had no word for what his son actually wanted. Dantes knew because he could feel the smallness coming for him and had already decided how he would outface it. Pushkin knew because he had said the true thing to Sologub in the study and had not unsaid it. There was one ending, and only the date was in doubt. And Natalia knew, sitting at the window with the figures that would not add, watching her sister try on, in the next room, with a terrible bright happiness, the wedding lace that the whole of Petersburg understood to be a bandage over a wound that had not closed. She knew it the way she had known standing in the nursery with the wooden horse, that the soft closing of the study door had divided her life. She knew that whatever this wedding was, it was not an ending. It was a held breath. And she had lived 4 years now in the apartment on the Moika, long enough to know the difference between the silence that was peace and the silence that was only a man deciding, very precisely, not to let her hear him load. The wedding changed nothing, exactly as she had known it would, and it changed everything in the way she had not predicted, which was that it gave Dantes a key. He was her brother now. He came to the apartment on the Moika, as family comes, without being announced, and he sat in the drawing-room with Katya on his arm and called Pushkin his brother-in-law in front of witnesses, and he looked at Natalia across the samovar with an expression of such tender, brotherly, insolent steadiness that there was nothing on earth a husband could do about it. He had found the one position from which a man could court a woman and dare her husband to object, and have the whole of society agree that the husband was a madman if he did. Petersburg, which loves a recovered situation more than it loves anything except a fresh scandal, decided the affair was over and the Pushkins reconciled, and went to its dinners and waited, the way a city waits, for the next thing. It came at one of the January soirees when Dantes, in front of a circle of people chosen for being the kind of people who would repeat it, made a joke. It was a pun, a coarse little play in French that turned on her family name, and the sense of it, stripped of the wordplay, was that he had married the sister to be near the wife, that his own wife knew it, that the whole arrangement was a comedy, and he the only man clever enough to have written it. People laughed. They laughed the particular laugh of people who know they are being given something to carry out of the room, and Natalia, who was standing close enough to hear it and to see Katya's face not change, because Katya had decided long ago that her face would never again be permitted to change, understood that the line was being drawn for her at last by someone else, and that it ran directly through her sister. She did the thing, that night, that she had not told anyone she had done, the thing without which she is not a person, but only a portrait. She let him walk her to the supper-room. It was nothing. It was 30 feet of parquet and a doorway. But he had asked, with the brother's right, in front of Katya, and to refuse would have been the scene she had spent 3 months avoiding. And so she took his arm, and for the length of that little walk, he said to her, low, in the French that the servants did not follow, the thing he had been building toward all winter, that he had married her sister to be allowed to stand beside her exactly like this, that he would go on standing beside her like this for 20 years if she required it, that there was a back staircase at his own house and an hour at which it was never used, and a key that he carried, and that no one in the whole watching, cruel city would ever know. And for 1/2 of 1 second, she was honest with herself about this until she died. It was the thing that let her bear the rest. She did not say no. She did not say yes either. She said nothing. She walked the 30 feet of parquet with her hand on the sleeve of the man the entire room believed she was betraying her husband with, and for the space of 1 breath she let herself feel the appalling simplicity of the offered escape. Not the romance of it, she had no romance left, but the arithmetic. A man who wanted her against a husband who needed her, a warm room against a window full of bills, the end of being the most watched and least consulted woman in Russia. She felt the door of it stand open. She felt the cold air of the other life come through it. Then she took her hand off his arm, in the doorway of the supper-room, in full view, which was itself a kind of statement, and she said, in Russian, which he barely understood, and which was therefore for herself, and not for him, "My husband is the better poet, monsieur, and you are not even the better dancer." And she went and stood by Katya for the rest of the evening, and held her sister's cold hand under the fold of a shawl, and did not let go. She told Pushkin none of it. She told him about the joke, because the joke was already in the city, and he would hear it from a worse mouth. She did not tell him about the staircase, or the key, or the half-second. But he was a man who read faces for a living, and he came home from a different party 3 nights later, white to the lips, and she knew he had been told, by someone, some version, and that the version had grown in the telling, as versions do. "Did he speak to you?" Pushkin said. "At the Vorontsovs?" "He speaks to me everywhere. He is my brother now. You arranged that I should have no defense against his speaking to me, you and Hecarin and the whole. Did he offer you anything?" The room was very quiet. The children were asleep. Alexandra had gone up. The fire had burned down to the red stage, where it gives heat without light, and in that half-dark she made the only choice that was wholly hers in the whole long affair, which was to tell her husband the truth. "Yes," she said, "a staircase and a key and an hour. I said no. I said no in the doorway, where the Trubetskayas could see me say it, which I did on purpose, so that there would be a witness. Because I have learned, Alexander, that in this city a thing is not true unless it is witnessed. That I may refuse a man 100 times in my own heart, and it counts for nothing, and refuse him once in a doorway, and it is at least a fact." She was not weeping. She had got past weeping somewhere in the autumn. "I have given you 4 children, and the keeping of your accounts, and the refusing of your enemies in public doorways, and I have asked you for warmth and a settled house, and I have got neither, and I am tired, and I will not be the reason you die. Do you hear me? I will not be it." He crossed the room and knelt by her chair, the great poet, the Kammerjunker, the man with the grey paper folded in the locked drawer, and he put his head against her knee, like one of the children, and she put her hand in his greying hair, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and it was, she thought, the first true silence of the third kind she had heard in that apartment in a year, the silence that was neither a poem written nor a poem refused, but 2 people sitting inside the same fear without lying about its size. It did not save him. Nothing was going to save him by then. But she would hold on to that quarter of an hour for the rest of her life, the knees and the firelight and the truth told, because it was the last time the apartment on the Moika was only theirs. The end came through paper, as the beginning had. Pushkin, who had withdrawn one challenge, could not withdraw the thing inside himself, and at the end of January he sat down at the desk, where Natalia was not permitted to come, and wrote a letter, not to Dantes, who was beneath his contempt now, a married fool, but to the father, to Hecarin, the Dutch envoy, the man who had crossed a ballroom by proxy and adopted a son by stratagem and bought a delay with a wedding. It was the most violent letter a careful man ever wrote. It called the ambassador a panda. It said that he, Hecarin, like an obscene old woman, had lain in wait at every corner for his, Pushkin's wife, and had whispered to her of his son's love, and had played the pimp's part while wearing the Tsar's accreditation, and that the writer could no longer suffer his family's name dragged through the gutters of the diplomatic corps, and that he forbade, the word was forbade, any member of the Hecarin household to cross his threshold again. A letter like that has only one answer in the world they lived in. It was not addressed to Dantes, but Dantes was the only one who could answer it, because a serving officer cannot let his adoptive father be called a panda in writing and remain a serving officer. And so the cartel came back across the city the next day, the second one, the real one, with no marriage left to stop it and no delay left to buy. And the seconds met, and the place was named, and the place was the one Pushkin had named to Sologub in November. The snow outside the city, the river, the birches. Natalia was not told. They never told her. On the last morning, she watched her husband leave the apartment in the heavy bearskin he wore against the cold, and she thought he was going to the bookshop or to the English club. And he kissed the children, and he was, she said afterward, gentler than usual, and he took down from the high shelf a small box she had never been allowed to dust, a flat box of polished wood that had been in the apartment as long as she had, and she had thought it held papers, and it did not hold papers, and she did not see what it held because he carried it under the bearskin, and the front door closed behind him with the same soft precision as the study door had closed in November. And she stood in the hall with a child on her hip and understood, far too late to do anything but understand, that the held breath was over. They brought him back across the Moika in the early dark, and she met them in the hall, and that is the place where the witnesses agree to stop, because what passed between them when she saw the front of his coat is in no memoir worth the name. He had been shot through the body at a place outside the city, on the snow, by the river, with a pistol from a matched pair, and the surgeon who came said the words that surgeons of that century said when they meant a man would die slowly and in great pain over 2 days, which were that the wound was very serious and that he should compose himself. He was 2 days dying. The apartment that had been too small to keep a marriage private was now too small to keep death private, and the street outside filled, first with carriages and then, as the news ran through the city, with people on foot, ordinary people, students and clerks and tradesmen's wives, thousands of them by the second day, standing in the January cold in front of the windows of the man who had been made to wear a boy's uniform, because it turned out that the city, which had laughed at the diploma, had also, all along, without telling its court, loved him. Natalia was not let into the room very often. The doctors thought her presence agitated him, and perhaps it did, and so she spent most of those 2 days on the other side of the study door, that door, listening to the sounds a man makes when he is leaving, and she did not get the long farewell that the legend would later award her. She got fragments. She got one moment when they admitted her, and he was lucid, and he took her hand and told her she was not guilty of anything, told her plainly, twice, in case she did not believe it the first time, that she had done nothing, that she should wear mourning for him for 2 years, and then marry again, and marry a decent man. And she said she would do the first, and would not promise the second, and he almost smiled. He died at a little before 3 in the afternoon, on the 29th of January, by the calendar they kept then, and a friend, who had been keeping the public informed, wrote a single line on a sheet of paper and pinned it to the door of the apartment for the crowd in the street to read. And the line said only that Pushkin was dead, and the grey city stood in front of those few words, in the snow, the way it had not stood in front of the grey diploma. And that was the difference between the 2 pieces of paper. And Natalia understood the difference for the rest of her life, and was never once consoled by it. The court was frightened of the crowd. It moved the funeral at the last hour and in secret from the cathedral the people expected to a small church, and then it sent the coffin out of the city by night, under a gendarme escort, to the monastery near the family estate where his mother lay, as though the body of a poet were a thing that might go off if too many people gathered near it. Dantes was tried by a military court, stripped of his rank, and expelled from Russia. He went back to France and lived, prosperously and long, into his 80s, a senator under another regime, and he is said to have remarked, as an old man, that if he had not killed Pushkin, he would never have made his career, and to have considered this a satisfactory accounting. Hikarin was recalled. Katya went with her husband to France and bore him children and died there, abroad, of a fever, before she was 40, having never, in any letter that survives, written one word against him. And Natalia, who was 24 when she fastened the camellia in the glass, went into the country with 4 children and her grief and a reputation that the city had already finished writing without consulting her. She went to her brother's estate in the Kaluga province, the old Goncharov country, the linen factories and the bronze emperors too large to sell, and she stayed there for 2 years in deep mourning, exactly as he had asked. And she did not go to balls, and she answered the letters that had to be answered, and burned a great many that did not, and she raised the children, and she got, slowly, the thing she had told him at the window she had married him to get, which was a settled house, though she got it at the only price the world had ever been willing to sell it to her for, which was his life. She married again after 7 years, when she was 31. She married a cavalry officer named Lanskoy, a quiet man of no great fortune and no wit at all to speak of, a man who had never written a line and never would. And the city, which had a long memory for the wrongs it had invented, said that she had been faithless after all, that she had wanted only a uniform, that the poet was barely cold. The city was wrong about that, the way it had been wrong about everything. Lanskoy was kind to the children. He let her keep the dead man's books and the dead man's portraits on the walls of his house, and he asked her nothing about the autumn of 1836, and in the long quiet of that second marriage, she became at last an ordinary woman in an ordinary house, which is the one thing a beautiful woman is almost never permitted to be, and it is possible, the people who knew her then believed it, that those were the only contented years she had. There is a story, and it may even be true, that late in her life a young man who admired Pushkin's poetry to the point of worship was presented to her at someone's house, and that he looked at the famous beauty, older now, the woman the textbooks were already starting to call the cause of the great poet's death, and that he could not keep a certain coldness out of his face, and that she saw it. She had spent a lifetime reading exactly that coldness off the faces of strangers, and that she said to him, quite gently, not as a defense, because she had stopped defending herself decades earlier, but simply as a correction of the record by the one person left alive who had stood in the room. "You did not know him, monsieur. I did. He told me I was not guilty. He told me twice, because he knew no one would believe it, and he was right, no one has, but he told me, and the man who knew best thought me innocent, and you, who did not know him at all, have decided otherwise. I find I can live with the difference." And then, the story says, she asked after the young man's mother, and the evening went on, and that was all. She died in the winter. The season had a long claim on her, of an inflammation of the lungs, in 1863, at 51. She had outlived the scandal by more than a quarter of a century, long enough to see the first biographies appear, long enough to read herself described, in print, by men who had not been born when she fastened the camellia, as vain, as cold, as the empty, beautiful instrument of a great man's destruction. She did not answer them. She had learned the lesson of the doorway and the lesson of the 2 pieces of paper a long time before, that a thing witnessed is a fact, and a thing unwitnessed is nothing, and that almost everything true about a marriage happens with no witness at all, in the half-dark, by a fire burned down to its red stage, where 2 people sit inside the same fear and do not lie to each other about its size, and that no biographer would ever find that room because it had only ever held 2 people, and one of them had been dead since he was 37, and the other had decided, in a country house among the linen factories, that some things are too valuable to spend on people who would not appreciate them properly. If a story like this stays with you, the next one will too. They are real people, every one, and the records they left are thinner and stranger and more human than the legends built on top of them, and that is the whole reason this channel exists. Subscribe, and the next of them will find you. The camellia, the white one, the single flower she had fastened into her hair in the glass on the evening of the 4th of November, while a man in the next room sealed a letter she was not allowed to read. That flower was thrown away by a maid the next morning, wilted, unremarkable, one of 1,000 flowers worn to 1,000 balls in a city that ate beautiful things for a living. And no one wrote it down, and no one kept it, and it is gone as completely as if it had never bloomed. Only she remembered it. She remembered it for 27 years. And on the nights when the house in the country was quiet, and the children were grown, and the second husband slept, she would sometimes stand at a glass, an older woman now, and lift her hand to her hair where the flower had been, and hold it there, in the dark, where there was no one to witness it, and therefore, by the cruel arithmetic of the city that had made her, where it did not count, and where, for that exact reason, it was at last entirely her own.